The Cicatrix of Ulmari Hive. An original Warhammer 40k short story. Prologue. In the depths of the segmentum obscurus lay Ulmari, an industrial world long devoted to the Imperium's endless wars. Its primary hive, designated Ulmari Hive Primus, sprawled across the horizon in countless tiers of decaying metal spires. Day and night were mere formalities amid the layers of ash-choked air. Plumes of toxic smoke belched out from manufactoria chimneys, obscuring the light of distant suns. Beneath these gloom-shrouded towers existed a labyrinth of corridors, hab-blocks stacked precariously, and shrines to the Emperor hidden behind layers of soot. Work never ceased. Faith never wavered. Or so the ecclesiarchy preached. Surrounded by the hum of heavy industry, the faithful labored on, ever watchful for the slightest taint of heresy or Xenos corruption. For in the Imperium of man, the greatest threat to humanity lay not always without, but often within. Our story begins in the seldom visited sub-level archives, where lost records accrued dust over centuries of layered bureaucratic routine. There, the seeds of tragedy were sown. Chapter 1. The Whispered Words. Tiber Malako did not recall a single day of sunshine in his life. Born in the mid-lowers of Ulmari Hive Primus, Tiber's childhood was a haze of ration lines, whispered threats, and unending nights. His ascent to the position of administratum scribe was a modest triumph. Though his pay was meager, and though the stench of chem exhaust clung to his patched robes, he clung to his duty with an almost spiritual devotion. He worked in a small cubicle, surrounded by towers of parchment and data slates. The ancient cogitators droned day and night. Half were broken, and the other half faltered unpredictably. Yet Tiber, with his stooped posture and near-perpetual cough, found solace among the dusty annals of imperial record-keeping. Order was his comfort, his bulwark against the swirling chaos of hive life. His day began, as it always did, with the scratch of quill across parchment. He was cataloguing ancient shipping manifests, cross-referencing the tithe logs for the planet's exports of munitions and ore. The other scribes coughed and muttered around him, each consumed by their own never-ending flow of data. Tiber's eyelids were heavy from too little sleep, but he pressed on. Work was worship. The Emperor demanded diligence. Then, without fanfare, Mendris Velas appeared at his desk. She was a fellow archivist seconded from the local ecclesiarchy chapter. A small woman, hair cropped short, posture rigid with devotion. Velas laid down a half-finished data slate with a single word on its cracked display. Ulmari. Cataclysm. Potential? Tiber looked up, brow furrowed. What's this? Velas spoke in hushed tones, casting a glance over her shoulder. A rumor, or so it was once. I stumbled on an old shelf in the ecclesiarchal archives. Something about a hidden text describing an unholy presence in the sublevels. Some hazard from centuries past. She paused, eyes flickering with cautious fear. I wanted your help verifying the authenticity. It might be nothing, but the record is fragmentary at best, heretical at worst. Tiber's eyes narrowed on the flickering data slate. It was unusual for an ecclesiarchy archivist to consult him on anything other than routine shipping logs or charitable donation ledgers. Where did you get this? Velas shook her head. One of the older priests had locked it away in a sealed drawer. Ancient data chits referencing the Cicatrix of Ulmari Hive. That's all I could decipher. The script was old and half-coded. I was told to destroy it. But my heart whispered that the Emperor demands we preserve knowledge, especially if it warns of a threat to the faithful. Mendris Velas was no radical. Tiber knew. She was devout to a fault. If she suspected something dire, Tiber could not dismiss her out of hand. Bring it to me after shift, he said quietly. We'll see what we can learn. Velas nodded. Be careful. The scribes say the word cicatrix can mean a scar or something left behind by a wound. Don't share this lightly. Tiber forced a weak smile. I have no one else to tell. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm klaxon echoed through the corridors, signifying a shift change or possible industrial accident. The gloom lights overhead flickered. Tiber shuddered, an inexplicable chill running down his spine. In the silence that followed, the Emperor's name was invoked among the scribes. Tiber's gaze fell upon that single cryptic word on the data slate, Cataclysm, Chapter 2, The Forbidden Scroll. That evening, after the labor chant ended and the sub-level was cleared of all but the most dedicated archivists, Tiber and Velas reconvened in a cramped antechamber, lit by a single, sputtering lumen globe. The walls were lined with rusted filing cabinets, many jammed shut, others left slightly ajar. The stale air smelled of old chemicals and mold. Velas rummaged through her satchel and brought out not just a data slate, but also a small vellum scroll sealed with a deep red wax. The impression on the wax was no official, administratum seal. It looked more like an older ecclesiastical sigil, one Tiber did not recognize. Found this with the data slate, Velas murmured, passing the scroll to Tiber. He broke the seal carefully, rolling open the parchment. Intricate spidery script formed a single paragraph. The language was High Gothic, but archaic. Tiber was no scholar, yet his position required rudimentary knowledge of older dialects. His lips moved, silently passing the text. In the final days of the reign of Lord Regent Kiridin, a scar was opened in the depths of Ulmari Hive. This wound was born from the unclean. The faithful sealed it with iron and prayer, but a piece of it, a shadow, lingered. Mark these words. Do not let it fester. Unhealed wounds breed new infection. Tiber felt his throat tighten. A shadow, a presence in the lower hive. Is this some allegory about a rebellious cult? Velas shrugged, equally uneasy. It might be. Or perhaps it references older heresies from the planet's past. The data slate references something called the cicatrix, a literal scar beneath the hive. The ecclesiarchy once contained it, or so the text implies. He looked at the second line, half faded. Should the wards fail, it shall spread anew. Blood calls to blood. Tiber nearly dropped the scroll. The swirling gloom lights and the echo of far-off machinery rattled him. I've never seen records of an official measure to seal something in the hive's sub-levels. But if the ecclesiarchy or the planetary governor wanted it hidden, they'd have buried the records. Emperor knows we bury countless secrets down here. Velas nodded. Then we dig deeper, cautiously. I fear that simply ignoring this might endanger us all. If it's just a folk tale, good. But if not, their eyes met. In that silent moment, Tiber understood the gravity of her concern. The Imperium thrived on vigilance. Heresy took root when vigilance waned. They parted ways, each vowing to scour separate archives for further mention of this so-called wound. Tiber's final words to Velas were a halting whisper. Whatever we do, we cannot alert the wrong people. If we raise an alarm prematurely, we'll be the ones purged. Velas tightened her lips. Then let us tread carefully, Tiber. The chill lingered, a foretaste of horror yet to come. Chapter 3, A Mechanicus Warning. Over the next few weeks, Tiber lost himself in the hidden corridors of data. He uncovered ancient shipping ledgers and repair logs, describing unusual structural work in the hive's sub-basement, reinforced vault doors, sealed catacombs. Always the final entries bore the same ominous phrase, access restricted by Ordo Hereticus. He found references to entire squads of Sisters of Battle deployed centuries prior, along with ecclesiarchal agents conducting purification rites. Such references were always cut short, blacked out, or coded. When Tiber cross-referenced them with more recent documents, he discovered that large sections of the Underhive had been cordoned off. No official reason was given, save for boilerplate phrases about structural instability or toxic flooding. One day, as Tiber was poring over archaic servitor maintenance rosters, a figure in crimson robes approached. Tiber nearly jumped when he noticed the servo arm protruding from the adept's bag. He recognized her from the halls of the local Adeptus Mechanicus station, Evandria Wraith, an overseeing adept responsible for monitoring the Hive's data nodes. "You are Tiber Malako," she stated without preamble, her voice clipped and metallic. She did not phrase it as a question. "I am," Tiber replied, uncertain. "You have business with me." Wraith inclined her head. "I have observed an unusual search pattern in your requests. You have been retrieving archival documents marked by the Mechanicus as partial Mechanicum concern. Why?" Tiber's heart raced. I am verifying older maintenance logs, some cross-referencing for the ecclesiarchy. It's normal procedure." Her expression was unreadable behind her augmetic eyes. "Irrelevant. Your search requests correlate with structural data regarding sealed sub-level sectors. The Mechanicus would advise caution. We have long sealed the old catacombs. Some secrets must remain sealed. The cost of breaching them is incalculable." Tiber found it hard to breathe under her piercing gaze. "Are you threatening me?" "I threaten no loyal servant of the Emperor, but you must know that rummaging in data-coded archives can lead to unfortunate misunderstandings. Be assured, the Mechanicus is aware of your queries." "I see." Tiber swallowed. "If it's so dangerous, why not share the reason with the Administratum? If there's a threat..." Wraith's voice rose, an unexpected edge to the metallic timbre. "Do not presume the Adeptus Mechanicus ignorant of threats. Some knowledge belongs in the shadows. If you are wise, scribe, you will abandon this path." She paused, eyes narrowing. "But, if you cannot know this, the wards in the sub-levels are failing. The sentry lock maintenance cycles cannot be sustained indefinitely. We do not have the manpower or resources to preserve them unassisted." Tiber's mind reeled. "Wards? You speak as though it's an actual phenomenon, not just structural barriers. Why would wards be needed if it's just a sealed vault?" Wraith's servo arm hissed menacingly. "Your curiosity teeters on heresy. That is all I can reveal." With that, she turned in a swirl of crimson robes and stalked off into the gloom, leaving Tiber trembling. Deep in his gut, he sensed he was stepping well beyond the boundaries of mortal knowledge. Yet turning back now felt impossible. Already, the cracks of potential doom had formed. Tiber couldn't simply ignore it. He bowed his head and whispered a silent prayer to the Emperor. Chapter 4. The First Blood. Just a few days later, shrill alarms tore through the Underhive. News filtered up to Tiber's level. The Planetary Defense Force had locked down sub-level corridors near the sealed catacombs. The reason was unclear. Some said a local gang war had escalated into open violence. Others whispered that an entire patrol of PDF troopers went missing in a region rumored to be uninhabitable. Lieutenant Garius Ralner, a young officer in battered flak armor, stormed into the archives that evening, flanked by 2 troopers. His face was drawn, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. "Scribe Malako," he demanded. "I'm told you have knowledge of old structural maps in this sector. I need them. Immediately." Tiber looked up from his desk, taking in the lieutenant's tense demeanor. He was no stranger to the demands of PDF officers, but something in Ralne's voice spoke of deeper urgency. "Yes, Lieutenant. I can gather them, though they may be incomplete. The sub-levels are labyrinthine, and many records are sealed. Ralne grimaced. We lost contact with the patrol. They vanished near the sealed vaults. My superiors want to sweep the area. He hesitated, and then his voice dropped. The men we sent. Their last Vox transmission was nonsense. Screams, ranting about shadows with eyes, words we can't decipher. Some are calling it a heretical hoax. I'm not so sure. Tiber tried to remain calm. I can help you find the records. Might I ask, how many troopers were lost? An entire squad, Ralne said. Good men. No traces of bodies, no signs of a firefight, just severed Vox comms. The words lodged in Tiber's chest, heavy as lead. The parallels with the rumors, the old scroll, the Adept's warning. They struck him like a hammer. It was happening. The cicatrix, the wound. Something was stirring. All right, Lieutenant, Tiber said quietly. Follow me. Let's see what the archives hold. Chapter 5. Descent into Darkness. For the next 2 hours, Tiber and Ralne sifted through the labyrinth of shelves. Velas joined them, quietly assisting wherever needed. They uncovered a large dog-eared ledger that contained partial sketches of the sub-level layout. The corridors leading to the sealed vault were heavily annotated with cautionary remarks and ecclesiarchal symbols. Decades-old footnotes referred to active wards, echoing the Mechanicus Adept's words. I can't decipher half these symbols, Ralne growled, slamming an armored fist on the table. We're soldiers, not warlocks. If something's truly down there, some leftover warp spawn or Xeno's abomination, we don't have the gear to face it. Velas's voice trembled. The old records say the sisters used flamers, blessed ammunitions, exorcisms. The structure was sealed under Ordo Hereticus directive. If it's undone... It can't be undone, Tiber interjected. If it is, the entire hive might be at risk. He turned to the lieutenant. You said you're authorized to lead a mission down there. Ralne nodded stiffly. We're the PDF. It's our duty to protect this hive. But if I see anything that reeks of heresy, I'm obligated to report it up the chain. The Ordo Hereticus might get involved. Then the entire hive could be quarantined or worse. An inquisitorial purge might follow. Silence fell. None dared speak that dread possibility aloud. That Ulmari Hive might be subject to exterminatus if the threat was deemed irredeemable. Finally, Ralne spoke again, voice subdued. I can't order you to come with me, but I'd be a fool to go without a guide who understands these old records. Tiber, Velas, will you accompany me? Velas, swallowing hard, moved to Tiber's side. Tiber looked between them, the desperation in Ralne's eyes, the quiet resolve in Velas's. Something compelled Tiber forward. The Emperor demanded that knowledge be used in service of humanity, not locked away when it was needed most. All right, Tiber said. Show me the way. Chapter 6. Sickness of the Soul. They descended at dawn according to hive chronometers, though no sunlight ever penetrated these depths. The PDF team was small. Lieutenant Ralne, 4 troopers clad in, flak armor, plus Tiber and Velas. They carried battered lasguns, a single heavy stubber, and meager rations. Their only guide, the fading map extracted from the archives. The trek took them through the slums of the Underhive, past flickering lumen strips and piping that dripped with foul-smelling liquid. The local gangers hid in the shadows, too wary of armed soldiers to cause trouble. As they went lower, the corridors fell silent. No human habitation thrived here, only labyrinths of twisted steel. They came upon a colossal metal door set into the rockcrete walls. Its surface was etched with ecclesiarchal iconography, long since corroded by centuries of damp. The door stood ajar, a chunk of it forced open from within. Tiber's heart pounded as he gazed upon the broken wards. Sigils once hammered into the frame had been defaced with deep scratches, forming crude, obscene shapes. "Blood of the Emperor," one trooper whispered, crossing himself. Something broke out. Ralne nodded grimly. "Let's move. Stay alert." They stepped beyond the threshold, following a spiraling passage descending deeper. Pale glow globes placed at intervals flickered with half-life. Velas let her gaze roam over the walls. Half-rusted chains dangled from iron rings, forming a macabre reminder of some ancient ritual. A warm, sickly odor pervaded the air, reminiscent of decaying flesh and rancid iron. Footsteps echoed in uneasy unison, each man and woman straining to hear the slightest disturbance. At last, they entered a wide chamber with pillars of corroded steel. At the chamber's heart lay an immense pit ringed by crumbling stone and tattered banners of old Imperial iconography. Black fluid seeped from cracks in the floor, forming stagnant pools. There, scattered across the stone, were the remains of the missing PDF squad. At least, what remained of them. Ragged lumps of flesh and shredded uniforms. No sign of battle or scorching from Labolds, only savage butchery. Tiber fell to his knees, gagging at the horror. A copper tang invaded his nostrils. "Form up," Ralne shouted. "Keep your weapons on that pit. Velas, Tiber, stay behind us." The troopers spread out, stepping carefully to avoid the gore. An uneasy hush choked the chamber. Then from below, a wet gurgling sound resonated. Something in the pit was stirring. One of the troopers, voxing the surface command, froze mid-sentence. A wave of rancid air surged from the pit, carrying a faint shriek, like nails on steel. Tiber's entire body seized with primal terror. Velas clutched at her rosary, lips moving in frantic prayer. Then it emerged. A figure clad in the shredded remains of a PDF uniform, but twisted beyond recognition. Its face was flayed, the skull exposed, yet it moved with vile animation, as if possessed by a puppeteer. Crimson light glowed in its hollowed eye sockets. With a jerking spasm, it bounded out of the pit, letting out an unholy shriek. Laser guns flared. The creature spasmed as it was riddled with impacts, yet it only roared louder, stumbling forward. The trooper behind the heavy stubber unleashed a hail of rounds. That punched through the abomination's torso, reducing it to chunks. The shrieking finally ceased. In the stunned silence, Tiber's mind reeled. This was no mere mutant or ganger. Something hideous had tainted the dead, reanimating them in unspeakable ways. Ralne turned, face pale. "We need to purge this place. By the throne, we need flamers, priests, an entire regiment. This is..." He never finished. From the shadows beyond the pit came more shapes. Gaunt figures, patched together from flesh and metal, crawling across the walls. A thrumming energy saturated the air, twisting the gloom lights into sickening hues. Tiber heard a voice in his head. An endless chant layered over itself, drilling into his psyche. Blood calls to blood. The scar is open. Velas screamed, pressing her hands to her ears. The troopers opened fire once more, raking the horrors with last shots. They fell in droves, but more emerged. One trooper got too close to a half-metal monstrosity. A bladed limb scythed into his neck, sending arterial spray across the chamber. Another trooper was dragged into the pit, his screams fading into the darkness. "Fall back!" Ralne roared. "Back to the door!" Tiber grabbed Velas by the arm, yanking her away from an oncoming fiend. The surviving two troopers and the lieutenant retreated, still firing. For a moment, it seemed they might escape, but the path behind them was no safer. The corridor roiled with flickering shadows, as if the walls themselves pulsed with malevolent life. Amid the chaos, Tiber felt something brush his mind. an intelligence lurking behind the gore and the horror. This was the cicatrix, a warp-tainted wound once sealed away. The wards were broken, undone by centuries of neglect. Now it demanded a harvest of souls to feed and grow. They stumbled through the twisted corridor, stepping over lumps of metal and ancient bone. At last, the battered survivors reached the chamber with the broken vault door. One trooper hammered the controls to reseal it, but the ancient mechanism whined uselessly. Ralner cursed, slamming his fist on the door's manual override. The screeching horrors approached, a chittering tide. "We can't close it from here," the trooper gasped. Velas lunged to the side, brandishing a small ecclesiarchy reliquary. She pressed its embossed Aquila symbol to a control panel and began murmuring a prayer. Through the flickering console lights, Tiber could see tears streaming down her cheeks. The power couplings crackled. She repeated the litany. Then, with a grinding shriek, the door slowly began to slide shut. A moment before it sealed, a spindly limb darted through the gap, clawing and scraping. The trooper fired a point-blank last shot, severing the limb. The heavy metal door thundered home. The corridor's lights flickered out, and silence swallowed them. In that final hush, they heard a faint rasping voice beyond the door. Blood calls to blood. Then it ebbed away, leaving only darkness and their ragged breathing. Chapter 7. Price of Revelation. Of the 7 who had descended, only 4 remained. Tiber, Velas, Ralne, and 1 shaken trooper. Their armor was splattered with gore, their eyes haunted. The ragged stump of a severed limb twitched near their feet, still leaking vile fluids. They retreated to an upper checkpoint, where more PDF squads waited in uneasy confusion. Ralne tried to give a report, but his words faltered. Eventually, commanding officers arrived, demanding clarity. So Tiber stepped forward, voice trembling, to recount the abominations they had witnessed. An uneasy hush gripped the assembled troopers. Some cursed the warp, others invoked the Emperor. Then, from a silent corner of the checkpoint, a figure wearing a hooded cloak stepped forward. An inquisitorial rosette glinted from a chain at their neck. The figure's voice was firm, cold. "I am authorized by the Holy Ordos to purge any and all taint. I request you speak only in truth, scribe." Tiber managed a feeble bow. "Yes, Inquisitor. There is some warp phenomenon. It's bursting free down there. Then we must ensure it does not breach the upper hive," the Inquisitor intoned. "I have a small retinue en route. We will seal these corridors with explosives and sanctified wards." He turned, eyeing Tiber. "The question remains. Can it truly be contained, or must sterner measures be taken?" I think it can be contained," Tiber said hastily. "If the wards are restored, the vault door might hold it back. The Mechanicus might help." The inquisitorial agent nodded slowly. "We will attempt it. But if the taint has spread too far, if the hive is compromised at its core..." The words lingered, unspoken. "Exterminatus." Ralne bristled. "This hive houses millions of souls." "Indeed," the Inquisitor said, "and better they be sacrificed than lost to the arch-enemy." Silence once again reigned. Across the corridor, the battered survivors realized that their fate, and that of every citizen in Ulmari Hive, rested on how effectively the Inquisitor could command the Imperium's resources to reseal the cicatrix. Chapter 8. The Final Stand. By the next day, the Hive's upper echelons were stirred into quiet panic. It was not a chaos that spilled into public rumor. The Inquisitor ensured that. Instead, a mixture of PDF squads and a few borrowed sororitas from a nearby shrine were gathered for a second descent, this time better armed with flamers, meltaguns, and the ecclesiarchy's blessings. Tiber and Velas were summoned again, though the Inquisitor did not require them to fight, only to guide the strike teams to the precise location. Ralne joined as well, but determined to see that his men's deaths were not in vain. They set out, moving swiftly through the labyrinth, retreading the same path as before. The battered vault door still stood sealed, but beyond it, the horrors waited. Under the stern direction of the Inquisitor, a pair of sororitas placed sanctified charges along the corridor's supports and lined the walls with purity seals. Ecclesiarchal litanies were chanted in unison, the air thick with incense. With methodical caution, the vault door was pried open again, just enough to allow the strike teams through. Immediately, howls and shrieks echoed from deeper within. The squads advanced, flamers hissing streams of promethium to incinerate any abominations lurking near. Tiber and Velas hung back, but they could not unsee the fresh wave of monstrosities. Flesh-sculpted forms crawled out of once flooded side passages, their bodies etched with crude runes. The sororitas responded with bolter fire and cleansing flame, chanting the Emperor's wrath. Screams of war and agony filled the corridors as both sides clashed. At last, the strike team reached the wide chamber with the pit. Tiber watched from the rear, heart pounding, as the sororita's sister superior bellowed a command. "Cleanse it!" bolters roared. Flamers unleashed swirling conflagrations that bathed the vile shapes in liquid fire. The stench of charred flesh was overwhelming. Yet from the pit rose that same intangible presence, pressing at the minds of friend and foe alike. Vela stumbled, pressing her hands to her temples. "It's so loud, the chanting," she whispered. Behind them, Tiber could see the sororitas valiantly pressing forward, but each step was a trial. The twisted remains of PDF troopers, half absorbed into a single mass of writhing limbs, clawed at the living. A sororitas was dragged under, her screams muffled by the roiling mass of flesh. Another sister ignited the horde with a purging blast that enveloped her comrade as well, granting a merciful end. Finally, amid the crescendo of violence, the Inquisitor stepped forth, raising an ornate relic that gleamed with holy sigils. With a solemn incantation, he aimed it at the pit, unleashing a surge of psychic energy. A wave of golden light erupted, colliding with the intangible. Darkness below. The warp presence howled in rage. The air crackled with ozone and the pit began to collapse inward, as though some gravitational force pulled it into itself. This was the moment to seal the chamber forever. Through the acrid haze, Tiber glimpsed Ralne, battered and bloodied, cradling a wound in his side. The lieutenant limped to the side of the chamber, priming the demolitions. One final wave of horrors emerged from the collapsing pit, shrieking mindlessly, their forms flickering in and out of phase. Tiber shouted a warning, but Ralne didn't waver. He pressed the detonator. An earth-shattering explosion tore through the sublevel, the floor buckling as huge slabs of rockcrete collapsed around the pit. The demons, or warp-spawned corpses, whatever they were crushed or hurled into the void. A wave of dust and debris swept the chamber. The ceiling groaned, then caved in. Somewhere in that chaos, Tiber lost sight of Ralne. The shockwave threw Tiber against a pillar, and darkness encroached. He caught a glimpse of Velas, her lips moving in a final prayer. Then the world ended in the roar of falling rock and the searing heat of meltdown. Chapter 9. A Scar Remains. Tiber awoke coughing, pinned under jagged rubble. A single lumen flickered overhead. His entire body screamed with pain, yet he was alive. By some miracle, the rock hadn't crushed his skull. Nearby, Velas lay on her side, eyes closed. He scrambled to free himself, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs, and crawled over to her. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. Tiber. I'm here, he managed, voice cracking. We're trapped. The passage behind them was entirely blocked by fallen debris. The main chamber, once the seat of abominations, was now a partially collapsed chasm. The stench of dust and death clung to the air. Tiber looked around, ignoring the claustrophobic darkness that pressed in from all sides. He spotted a single battered figure slumped in the debris, Lieutenant Ralne. The man's chest did not rise. Tiber murmured a shaky benediction, honoring the lieutenant's sacrifice. Of the sororitas and the Inquisitor's retinue, there was no sign, only twisted remains scattered about. Velas propped herself up on an elbow, face lined with despair. The wound. Did we seal it? Tiber forced himself to look at the collapsed pit. The warp presence felt diminished, though faint tremors of malevolence still clung to the air. I think we sealed the chamber. This entire place is caved in. If we can get out, maybe the rest can too. She slowly sat up, wincing. The Emperor protects. They shared a weary, grateful smile. But in the flickering gloom, Tiber's senses prickled with lingering dread. A faint noise came from beneath the rubble. Not a bestial roar now, more like a weak pulse, a low hum reverberating through the iron bones of the hive. Velas reached out, clasping Tiber's hand. In her other hand, she still held the ecclesiarchy reliquary. We have to try to find a way out. Yes, Tiber whispered, though fear coiled in his stomach. He remembered the scroll's warning. Should the wards fail, it shall spread anew. They had collapsed the chamber, but was the warp's cicatrix truly gone, or merely forced to find another path? The metal beneath them shuddered faintly, as though responding to his unspoken question. Tiber's eyes flicked to Velas. Her face mirrored his dread. Neither spoke the fear aloud, but both knew. A scar does not simply vanish. It can fester beneath the surface, hidden yet present, waiting for the next moment of weakness. Gathering the last shreds of strength, they rose to their feet and began searching for a pathway back to the surface, guided by the sputtering lumen and unwavering faith in the Emperor. Epilogue. Days later, word spread through the mid-hive that a significant quake had collapsed several sub-level corridors. The official story, a catastrophic structural failure near a disused catacomb. Workers were sent in to bolster the supports. There were rumors of missing PDF squads and smoke-blackened sororitas, but rumor was all it remained. Behind the scenes, at the Inquisitor's command, the vault doors and their surroundings were layered in fresh wards, reinforced with Mechanicus augments. The few survivors were whisked away, isolated or quietly reassigned. In time, the events in the sublevels would be left as a footnote, sealed away in coded archives. Ulmari Hive continued its relentless production, ignorant of the monstrous truths beneath its foundations. In a forgotten corner of the Underhive, Tiber Malako and Mendris Velas sat in a cramped Medici station. Neither had slept well since their ordeal. Tiber's wounds, while healing, throbbed incessantly, and every time he closed his eyes, nightmares of rotting horrors haunted him. Velas was quieter than before, a far-off look in her gaze. One day, they were summoned by an austere ecclesiarchy official. Ranks of servo skulls floated behind him, recording everything. He questioned them calmly, methodically, about the vault, the incident, and how they had come to discover it. Tiber told as much truth as he dared. The official listened, nodding, then offered them new postings, safer perhaps, or at least far away from the sublevels. That evening, Tiber found Velas packing. "You're leaving Ulmari?" he asked softly. She looked at him with hollow eyes. The ecclesiarchy is transferring me to the shrine world of Dolorius. They say it's a reward, but I suspect it's just to keep me silent. Tiber tried to form words of consolation, but failed. The shadow of what they had witnessed bound them together in ways no words could sever. He reached out, touching her hand. "May the Emperor guide your path, Mendris." She closed her eyes. "And yours." Tiber watched her depart, the echoes of her footsteps lost amid the Medici station's bustle. She at least would find new purpose. He, on the other hand, was simply told to resume normal duties. But no day would be normal again. Late that night, Tiber stood at the window of a mid-hive corridor, looking out over the endless spires. The city glowed with industrial might. Millions toiled below, oblivious to how close they had come to total annihilation. Tiber whispered a prayer of thanks that they had, for now, avoided that grim fate. Yet in his heart, he felt the hive's metal skeleton trembling with quiet dread. The old scroll's warnings stayed with him. A scar does not vanish. It can reopen. Ulmari Hive had survived, but the Imperium of man bore countless such scars across innumerable worlds. Any moment, those scars could bleed again. As Tiber turned from the window, a swirl of dust caught the corridor's lumen, dancing in intangible patterns. He paused, a subtle chill coursing through him. Were those shapes in the dust, or was his mind playing tricks? He offered one final prayer to the Emperor, then continued down the corridor alone, his fate uncertain in the gloom that stretched before him. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no true solace, only vigilance and the knowledge that horror lurks beyond every sealed door, waiting to break free.